when working with difficult conversations and in conflict, one of the big challenges is that we judge each other, and we judge each other harshly. And for me, curiosity is a really wonderful antidote to judgment, that it's hard to stay judgmental if we practice curiosity. And I do see curiosity as a practice.
Hi everyone, my name's Michelle Grant, and this is the Grateful Podcast, a place where we explore how each of us can eat, live, and lead to create a more sustainable world. On this podcast, we have conversations with inspiring and courageous leaders who are trying to shape their food systems, their communities, and their own lives to be more sustainable, joyful, and purpose-driven. And when it comes to creating that change, the key word really is courage. And that's why today I'm chatting with Beccie D'Cunha, who is the founder of Courage Lab, an organization that supports both leaders and teams to have courageous conversations that help them get unstuck and create resilient and creative organizations that then allow them to collectively have a shared impact in the world around them. And Beccie came to this work from years of experience as a social justice campaigner, as a CEO and director in the not-for-profit sector, and for the last 20 years as a facilitator and conflict mediator. And through all this work, Beccie saw that whenever we're talking about trying to have an impact, it's always, in the end, coming down to the question of courage. That if we want to lead and create positive change, we need to understand the role that courage plays. So I met Beccie a couple of years ago in a program called Vision 2020, which brings together founders of purpose-driven organizations who are looking to build communities to have a shared impact. So Beccie and I immediately found some synergies and commonalities in what we were trying to do. As I was setting up the Grateful and the Be the Change Leadership program, she was setting up Courage Lab and her Courageous Leaders program. And aside from this shared interest in creating positive impact and leadership, we also have a shared passion for the Enneagram. So we're both certified Enneagram practitioners and have literally spent hours going down the rabbit hole talking about that. That's not the topic today. We're really focusing today on the topic of courage. This conversation that I'm sharing with you today was actually recorded as a part of a session with my Grateful community. At the end of the Be the Change program, the community members often have a desire to keep exploring this topic of courage. And so we invited Beccie in to do a workshop with us. And this conversation that you're hearing now was just the introduction to that workshop before we jumped into some of the more interactive aspects of it. Now, to help frame today's conversation, when I think about the role that courage plays in creating change, I usually think about three things. Firstly, the courage to leave behind the old. Secondly, the courage to envisage and experiment with the new. And finally, the courage to challenge the status quo, to face difficult conversations and difficult emotions that are always a part of that process. And in today's chat with Beccie, we're really focusing on this third point, how courage can help us challenge the status quo, face difficult conversations and emotions, and what that means for each of us as courageous leaders. I'm really interested to know what motivated you to set up Courage Lab and what do you hope that it changes in the world?
When I look back, I realised that courage has been the thread running through all my different roles and the different work that I've done. I started out as a social justice campaigner working on issues like the arms trade, so social justice and peace issues. And I guess that was all about campaigning, as I'm sure many of you are campaigners as well, and change makers, is about courage. It's about the courage to speak up, to challenge injustice. And I've been a leader. That was a real kind of courage building experience as well, like leading courageously through times of crisis, through times of change and uncertainty, as well as just day-to-day leadership challenges that I think require courage and build courage. And then as a mediator, the work is all about courage. It's about moving towards the things that we avoid. So I think of it as kind of moving towards the fire in many ways. It's the stuff that everyone wants to run away from, but actually the growth and learning and resolution comes if we move towards the difficulty. And then Courage Lab now, it's all about courageous conversations and courageous relationships. So it kind of pulls all of that together, I think. And it's been a journey of developing my own courage as well as working out how to help others to develop their courage.
I think that that's often what we are called to bring into the world are the things that we want to build, work on, or grow ourselves, right?
I know that for myself, part of my courage journey, I guess, has been about working through that and standing up for myself, understanding my own needs and asserting them as well. And even if that upsets the other person, but finding a way to do it with empathy and honesty. Yes. Yeah. So I agree. We're drawn to the things that we need to work on ourselves often.
But I also like to hear how you reframed challenging or a challenging situation as courage building. I think that's a very nice mindset flip for all of us, that when we are facing struggle or challenges, to think, this is courage building. It's a kind of more positive framing of a difficult situation.
Yeah, that's what we do as mediators. It's all about reframing, actually. It's all about kind of finding the opportunity in the difficulty, I guess, without taking away from the difficult bits, but kind of finding the moments of opportunity as well. Yeah.
Very nice. So what role do you think courage plays in helping lead this transformation that we're seeking in the world around us?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I know that we share this, Michelle, and the work that you do with Be the Change, that I firmly believe that it has to start with us, that change only happens if we work on ourselves, and that kind of inner change leads to outer transformation. Our ability to change the world is really limited until we've worked on our own stuff, whether that's our self-limiting beliefs or the things that trigger us in our relationships. And there's different reasons I became a mediator. I was already a campaigner. That was the work I was doing. But one of the reasons was that I saw around me a lot of anger in the campaigning community and the not-for-profit community, a lot of kind of angry campaigning, and sometimes violent campaigning in terms of not physical violence, but violence in language and attitude. And I also saw a lot of burnout, unhappy people in that community, and a lot of conflict, a lot of people who were really passionate about changing the world, but they didn't know how to have healthy relationships within that workplace. And so I wanted to change that. And I also realized that change needed to happen from within. So it was a bit of a journey of realizing or facing the kind of violence in me, the judgmentalism, the anger, the prejudices, all of that, and being honest about recognizing that and then working on it. And so for me, mediation was part of that journey, because mediation is about justice. It's about justice in relationships, giving everyone a voice, listening to your enemy in a sense. And that's kind of so for me, it has to start with us, I think, and that inner work that leads to the kind of outer change.
Yes, that's what we're all about here. And you've touched on a lot of these points already, but maybe just sort of to summarize it, what do you see are the main connections between courage and leadership?
Yeah, good question. So for me, leadership is pretty much all about courage. I do a lot of work to support leaders to become more courageous. And the things that require courage as a leader are things like being able to talk about difference and help others to talk about difference, being able to speaking up, being an upstander, not a kind of bystander if something around us isn't right, if there's something that's not fair. It takes courage to listen to people, to genuinely kind of listen to feedback and take that on board, to hear the difficult things when people kind of hold the mirror up to us, and that's really painful, but to hear that and take that on board, to support people through tough times, crisis, if we are leading people or teams, to support people through crisis or change or uncertainty, which is everywhere at the moment. There's something about kind of difficult decisions that might not please people, but that are the right decisions to make, and the courage that comes with that integrity, courage to have difficult conversations, to face conflict. So often that's a lot of my work, is to help leaders and teams to face conflict rather than avoid it and shove it under the carpet. And I think that's what when I've been a leader and a manager of people, I've spent a lot of my time mediating between people. And that is part of leadership, to help people to build strong relationships around you and to help others to talk about the things that are difficult and the conflict.
It's something that I'd be interested to know, because I think that courage is often conflated with confidence. Do you have anything to say about that? What's the difference between courage and confidence?
Yeah, good question. I don't think it is the same. I mean, there's a relationship there, but for me, courage is stepping into things that we don't feel confident in sometimes. So, for instance, in working with conflict, I'm helping people in a mediation situation, I'm helping parties to step into completely unknown territory where they're being vulnerable with each other and talking about their feelings in a way that they haven't done before, or finding their voice, learning to empathize if they're not good at that. And often they're things that they're not confident in, but the courage is in trying it anyway. I think courage is about action in many ways, and that taking courageous action kind of makes us become more courageous as well. It changes us every time we do it.
Brené Brown is perhaps the most famous for shedding light on the fact that there is no courage without vulnerability. Could you talk a little bit about the connection between these two terms?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Brené Brown's work, and there's a lot of echoes of what she says and her approach in the way that I work. And so my work is all about vulnerability. It's about supporting people to let their guard down, to take the risks it could be the risks around sharing how they feel, because that is risky to people. And I think that takes vulnerability and takes courage. People are often afraid of letting the other person know that they've been impacted by something, a conflict, and that takes vulnerability. It could be about the kind of vulnerability to name our fears to somebody, or to own our mistakes and the things where we've slipped up. For me, all of that's about vulnerability. And I think that's what courage is really about, is that the Latin root of the word courage is cor, C-O-R, which means heart. The original meaning of the word courage is about speaking what's in our heart and on our minds, and being wholehearted, I guess. And Brené Brown talks a lot about wholehearted leadership, and I really like that. That's exposing, I guess, speaking from our heart, sharing what's in our heart, sharing what's on our mind, sharing our feelings. All of that is exposing. We're opening ourselves up to others. And I think that that's deeply rewarding, and that's where relationships are really enriched. But it's scary for most people, and it's vulnerable. Without that vulnerability, we can't have courageous relationships. We can't have real relationships.
Yeah, and we can't have any change, I don't think, if we're not willing to be vulnerable about what's not working and how it's making us feel as well. Yeah,
absolutely.
So, I mean, you've talked a lot about the role of courage in conflict, in difficult conversation. How do you think it can help us move from this artificial harmony I've heard you speak about to healthy conflict, or, moving towards the things that we avoid, particularly in these, tense situations, difficult conversations, conflict situations?
So I think most cultures, as in workplace cultures, and people towards either kind of artificial harmony, so being too nice to each other, or thinking that it's all about niceness and politeness. Maybe in England that's definitely the case. So they either err towards that kind of niceness, artificial harmony, where we're pretending things are okay almost because we don't want to rock the boat, or they go the other way and people are too aggressive with each other, almost brutally honest, more direct, and that leads to kind of a toxic conflict culture. And so for me, difficult conversations and courageous conversations are about kind of timely interventions that build healthier conflict cultures instead of those two extremes. And difficult conversations for me are around combining empathy with honesty. Often people are good at one or the other, but it's hard to do both at the same time. And I think that's what's required. It's that speaking honestly about what's going on for us from the heart as well as the head, but at the same time being mindful of how the other person is going to feel when they hear that, and really working to put ourselves in their shoes and what their context might be and the reason they might have behaved in that way. I guess a lot of my work as well is around, for me, coming back to the artificial harmony thing. I think I use an iceberg analogy quite a lot, that often in relationships and in teams, there's the stuff that's above the waterline, the bit of the iceberg, the small bit of the iceberg that's visible above the waterline, some debate and facts and things like that. But my work is often about surfacing the stuff that's under the waterline, the feelings, the hurt, the fears, the judgments, the beliefs, all of that stuff. So surfacing kind of the difficult feelings, but also the difficult opinions, the opinions that might maybe differ, to help people to really speak what's in their mind and be honest about it, even if it makes the waters a bit choppy. And that's the bit that it takes courage, because those bits are more unpredictable and they require vulnerability and they're uncomfortable. We don't know if we have those difficult conversations, if we surface that stuff as a leader, are we going to be blamed? Is it going to be aimed at us? Is it going to explode in our faces? Difficult conversations, they surface the stuff that people they might not be conscious of it, and they're definitely not talking about it. It's putting that stuff on the table or above the surface so that you can work with it. And actually that's what makes teams stronger, I think, and relationships stronger, that kind of being able to face that stuff together, and it deepens relationships. But it isn't easy. And the reason people avoid it is because it might not feel as harmonious, but it will be more collaborative, more creative, more meaningful and healthier, because everything is kind of being dealt with. But I often do say to people in a mediation setting, or when I'm facilitating work with teams, that I prepare them that it will be uncomfortable. I make sure it's safe, but it will be uncomfortable at times. And I always know that they're making progress if it is uncomfortable, because actually they're talking about the really important stuff if it is the stuff that really matters. And I also often say that it will get harder before it gets easier, because again, they're moving kind of towards the fire, they're moving towards the really tough stuff. And that is painful in some ways, but if they can do that, they'll really strengthen their own resilience and their own relationships.
Yeah, I like the way you describe that as an iceberg, and it reminds me a lot of what they talk about in this book, Difficult Conversations, too, that often we're on the tip of the iceberg discussing the who did what happened, the logistics of the topic, but underneath is the emotions conversation, the identity conversation. And this is super timely because that's the book in our book club for the community for this next round. And it's also the module that's coming up next week for those of you that are in the Be the Change program at the moment. So it's a nice little taster for those things. We've already mentioned Brené Brown, which is inevitable when I'm talking about courage, but I'm going to mention her again because she talks about concepts called armored leadership and daring leadership, and argues that we need more daring leadership in the world. So what's your take on these two terms, and how do you think that we can apply these to create the change we want to see in the world around us?
So I really like those definitions. And for me, daring leadership is about letting down our guard. It's taking off our armor. And it comes back to that vulnerability piece that because we might feel kind of exposed in some ways by showing our feelings, by taking risks in terms of saying what our weaknesses are, or our blind spots, or where we've made a mistake. All of that is I think daring rather than armored. It's taking the armor off. And I really believe that that's what's important. And my most poignant and courage building moments as a leader have been when I've done that, when I've taken my armor off. There've been various times where teams that I've been leading, organizations I've been leading, have faced really tough times, financially tough times and crises. And there was one moment that comes to mind where a charity that I was running, where I had to basically break the news to staff that there were going to be redundancies and we had to restructure, but we didn't know at that point what roles were going to go. And there was a moment in the meeting where I kind of started to cry, and I'm a bit of a weeper anyway. It was partly out of grief for the organisation and grief for the people that were losing their jobs, but also I knew that my job was vulnerable as well. And I shared that with them. And I was facing redundancy, and in the end, actually, my role was made redundant. But for me, that was a really powerful moment for us all. It basically really strengthened all our relationships, and it meant that it created a space, I guess I was modeling, that actually we can talk about feelings. It doesn't have to be kind of cold, objective conversations. This is going to be a really tough time, and we need to be able to process that together. And so it normalized talking about feelings. And so others were able to do the same, whether privately to me or in that team setting. I think leaders have to be willing to do that. We don't want to overshare, because I think that's not helpful either. And I think Brené Brown talks about that too. But knowing, and it takes judgment, but the willingness to take our armor off and take that risk, let people in a bit and show that we're human, for me is really important.
Yeah, that's a really nice summary. Thank you. You spoke before about courage building practices. So what are the types of practices you typically work with? What do you offer to people that you're coaching or mediating to help them build their courage?
So a lot of it is about noticing. So that being present and noticing what's going on, listening kind of really deeply, inwardly and outwardly. So noticing our feelings in the moment, that emotional intelligence, noticing what we might be needing that we're not getting, noticing what triggers us, noticing in our body when we have a reaction to something difficult or to a behavior, noticing if we have an instinct to run away, just kind of noticing it, but in a non-judgmental way. The other thing is notice the empathy. And for me, a lot of that is about noticing in others, having a kind of radar out to feelings and need for what might the other person be feeling, looking for those cues. And so that stuff builds courage, because it's about the courage to sit in discomfort rather than trying to run away from it, but to sit in it in an empathic way, not an aggressive way, which I think is what the courage piece is about. So noticing so that we're more able to just observe ourselves, but try to gradually start to take small steps. And I think it is about small steps to build up our courage in those difficult situations. So we might retreat the first time, but then next time we might be able to just stay with it a little bit longer. It's that building up our emotional intelligence, our self-awareness, so that we can notice what happens in us and in others. And then for me, there's practicing curiosity is really important. I think when working with difficult conversations and in conflict, I think one of the big challenges is that we judge each other, and we judge each other harshly in conflict often. And for me, curiosity is a really wonderful antidote to judgment, that it's hard to stay judgmental if we practice curiosity. And I do see curiosity as a practice. So if I feel myself start to judge somebody, and it happens all the time, I thought I'd get less judgmental the more I practice as a mediator, but actually I think it's the other way around. But hopefully I'm not becoming more judgmental. It's more just that I'm noticing when I am. And so it's something about, again, noticing when I start to judge in the moment, and then what I do to overcome that judgment, because I need to stay impartial as a mediator and treat everyone fairly. And if I judge, I can't empathize and I lose the connection. So I need to work hard on it. So what I do is I ask curious questions, and I keep asking them, and I ask why questions usually. So if someone's told me something that's kind of triggering for me, they've done something that just seems so outrageous or so mean, it might be take a deep breath. I'll notice that I'm starting to feel a bit of judgment rising. Help me to understand what you were feeling when you did that, or help me to understand why you did that. And I know that the more curious questions I ask, and often the more why questions I ask, the more I'll get under the surface, and I'll find a connection with that person again. I'll find a point where I can empathize with them again, because I'll remember that they're a human being with feelings, with needs, and that they were just in a difficult place, and that there was a reason for it, because most people don't intend to cause hurt to others. They do it unintentionally. So for me, that's that curiosity, trying to ask why and stay curious even when we're starting to feel judgment. And I guess there's one other that might be a kind of practical thing that might be helpful. It's a negotiation technique. And so if we're avoiding a difficult conversation or a conflict, there's something called BATNA, WATNA and MALATNA. And it's quite simple that BATNA is best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So it doesn't have to be framed in that way, but just to give you the context of it. So the idea is you just think through, okay, if I don't have the conversation, what's the best that could happen? What's the best case scenario? And then the next one is WATNA, what's worst alternative? Okay, if I don't have the conversation, what's the worst that can happen? And okay, if I don't have the conversation, what's the MALATNA is most likely. So we're just thinking it through, and then we flip it and think, okay, if I have the conversation, what's the best, worst, and most likely outcome or scenario? And it helps us to just think, I guess there's something powerful about naming for ourselves what our worst fears are, as well as what our best hopes are, the magic wand kind of scenario, but weighing them up then and working out what's the most likely, because often our worst fears are really unlikely to be realized. You know, it might be worst fears like they'll use it against me, or I might cry. Okay, so what if you do cry? What's the worst that will kind of happen as a result of that? It's a way, I suppose, of processing some of that and stepping out of the emotion for a moment to just work out logically, do some problem solving around it.
Mm. Oh, very nice. I like that. And I guess that was framed around a conversation, but you could frame it around any action, right? Like if I do take this path of action, or if I don't, to go through these different scenarios. Very nice.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I know, I talked about these 3 ways courage is showing up for me in the beginning, the courage to leave behind the old, the courage to experiment with something new. And then this last part was this kind of courage around these difficult conversations. I know you and I have been going through a process recently of also looking at these first 2 of letting go of the old and experimenting with the new. So in that process for yourself, what have been some courage building activities you've been working on, or things you've been doing with yourself as you're building something new and letting go of something old?
Well, I find rituals quite powerful. And by that, I mean kind of something that's, I guess, embodied to and actually do something to signify or symbolize the stepping away from the old and into the new. And I do that sometimes with others in the different work that I do with leaders or teams as well. So that can be quite kind of powerful and can bring kind of insights with it, I think, if we use objects or do something physical. For me, I guess part of my journey has been realizing how other referencing I am. So I'm often would seek validation or ideas, etc., from others. And I still need to do that. But what I know I need to do when it's kind of important decisions or important changes is spend more time with looking inward. And so the stuff that I don't naturally do because I'm very extrovert and a lot of my energy is expended in relationships and conversations. That's why I do the work I do, I suppose. But practices that I know help me is things like journaling, doing solitary kind of activities to process some of that stuff. And some of the stuff I've already talked about, but thinking through the drivers, the things that, what am I kind of holding on to, what's that I'm struggling to let go of, why, the curiosity again, how am I feeling and how's that kind of driving my behavior? What am I scared of? What am I fearful of? And reality checking that a bit. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Have some similar practices, so it was nice to hear. So in the course of your work, have you seen any particular nuances to how women experience courage in leadership specifically? And maybe linked to that, do you have any sort of special messages to aspiring women leaders from what you've experienced?
Yeah, well, I guess it's been quite a personal struggle, that one, because I'm a woman and I've been in leadership. I remember someone once telling me that their boss had said to wear heels in board meetings. She was in a corporate environment, I wasn't, but because being tall helps to be more influential. And at that point, I was like, I am completely doomed then because you can't tell here, but I'm 5'2" on a good day. And so, yeah, something about being a small woman and also being a smiley woman, I would sometimes show up in a room and I could just tell that people were surprised to hear that I was a director or a CEO, that they wouldn't have guessed it. That you can see straight away that they're assuming it's the tall man that I'm standing next to that's in that role. And so I kind of was quite conscious of that, particularly like, late 20s, early 30s. A lot of us as women have been, I guess, conditioned to find some aspects of courage harder and some aspects easier. So I think the things that maybe come easier to us often as women are empathy, which I think is courageous, listening, curiosity, and also I think negotiation, collaboration, win-win, problem solving, that I think again require real courage. Often as women, we've kind of learned that because we've had to influence from an early age because we're often trying to influence the people in power. So we found those ways to influence and I think they take courage. For me, the harder bits are often, again, in terms of our conditioning, and I relate to this myself as a woman, is the direct, honest feedback, the naming our own needs and asserting those, challenging the injustices we're facing. We might challenge them for other people, but challenging our own, the prejudices and injustices we are faced with as women. And maybe we're used to putting others first and supporting others rather than our own needs and goals. The stuff that I do is often helping others to do what I struggle to do myself, because I know I'm often, it's the desire to please or the self-doubt that creeps in, all of the stuff that can kind of get in the way, I guess, of courage. But in terms of advice for aspiring female leaders, I guess it's a bit cliched, but for me, it is about authenticity, that being comfortable in our own skin and comfortable that what we bring, that more empathic, less dominant style of leadership, more empowering style of leadership, is really world changing. And I genuinely believe it is. And really playing to that as a strength, really like knowing it, owning it, and then developing it, building around those talents. And to help me to kind of work on the bits that I find harder, I've almost drawn on those natural strengths. So, my ability to read other people and read a room, I have to kind of consciously then do it to myself, and look inward and think, what am I feeling? What are my needs here? Yeah, I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are on that, Michelle, as well.
Yeah, what really struck a chord with me is seeing these traditionally feminine leadership qualities as our strength, as our thing to put in the forefront, as our thing to be proud of, rather than constantly trying to fit into the existing mold and suppress all of those things in the process. I feel like it's almost like a peeling of an onion or a kind of an unlayering that happens. And for me, it took many years of work playing what I felt in some ways were kind of roles of what I felt was expected as a leader, and always feeling I was pushing away these other sides. So the more that we can all collectively support each other to bring those to the forefront, the better the world is. And to do that, it requires vulnerability and courage front and center. Just to wrap up, so the name of our community is The Grateful Community. The name of the podcast is The Grateful Podcast. What does it mean to you to live a great and full life?
Nice. Lovely question. Great name as well. I really like the name. I guess for me, I suppose it is about connection. It's about being really connected to who I am. And that's a lifetime journey. That's a lot of my work, is to kind of understand myself better, because it doesn't come naturally to me. I'm much better at understanding others. So it's about that connection with self and connection with other, and deepening that. And then out of that, learning to harness what we do best. I'm a big believer in positive psychology and strengths-based work and living and leadership. So really knowing what our kind of natural strengths and superpowers are, our natural talents, and then honing those and doing those things every day. And I think that's why I love my work so much, because I've pulled together all the things I'm kind of best at. And if we can do the things that we do well every day, I think that's deeply fulfilling.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Grateful Podcast. If you liked it, then please go ahead and subscribe and share it with a friend. And I would love to get your questions answered here. So if you have something that you would like me to explore on the show, go ahead, pull out your phone, open up the voice memo app, hit record, and then email it to podcast@thegrateful.com.